Thank you, John. We now record, and we have received a message from for our event from the South African High Commissioner. Nomathembi Tambo is, of course, the daughter of Oliver and Adelaide Tambo. And I'll ask Brian Brown from South Africa, who also has worked with the Arch in his time in South Africa. So, sorry, if you're not speaking, can you mute yourself, please? So I'm asking Brian to just share this message from the South African High Commissioner here with us to set off our meeting. Brian.
Thank you, David. Message from High Commissioner Nomathembi Tambo.
Yes.
To the Program Director, representatives of the Tutu Foundation, leaders of all faith denominations present, and distinguished guests. You will all agree that the late Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu was a global icon who advocated for peace, justice, and human rights throughout the world. The Arch, as he was affectionately known, dedicated his life to the noble causes of freedom, democracy, service to humanity, among others. Today, we must encourage humanity to emulate the values and the teachings of the late Archbishop Tutu. Strive to become exceptional human beings of great moral stature. As South Africa, we were honored to have had the privilege to learn about the importance of forgiveness, as demonstrated by Archbishop Tutu during the Truth and Reconciliation process. This is the gift South Africa wishes to share with the world as we strive for a better world. As a nation, we have an obligation to continue on this path, to make meaningful impact in our communities, and conduct ourselves with integrity and humility. We will always remember the Arch for his jovial demeanor. May we celebrate his life and spread his message of equality and peace. I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Brian, for sharing that with us. And I should just add, Brian has his own book recently published called Apartheid South Africa, exclamation mark, Apartheid Israel, question mark. And there'll be some details about that in the chat. Now, Professor Sarojini Nadar was the chief editor of the book we're celebrating this afternoon, published by Regnum Books and the University of the Western Cape jointly. Sarojini is the director of the Centre for Religion and Social Justice at UWC, has a wide range of research interests herself, with a particular interest perhaps on gender issues. And we warmly invite her to give us an overview of the main themes in the book. Sarojini.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much also for having me. Sorry, I just need to adjust my the view that I have here. So please, will you just give me a moment? Here we go. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. Did we lose sound?
No, we should.
Is it on? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Tony Holden, can you mute, please? Sarojini, you have the floor.
Thank you. So good afternoon, friends, and thank you for this invitation to share a few thoughts about and from our book, Ecumenical Encounters with Desmond and Tutu, Visions for Justice, Dignity and Peace. Which Brian, yes. So the introduction that I wrote to the book, providing a snapshot of the book, was almost 12,000 words. Our ever reliable source of knowledge, Google, tells me that I can humanly hope to speak about 2,000 words in the space of the 15 minutes that I've been given. So needless to say, I can't share all the riches that we have collected in this book. And I'm so pleased that two of the other editors, Rudolf Heinz and Dietrich Verner, are here as well, and they will contribute to what I'm sure is going to be a rich discussion later. But I suppose I can only share with you just, you know, part of what this book contains, and that's not very easy to do. So how to summarize and characterize this collection of 72 contributions from all over the world, actually, that reflect on the life and legacy of this phenomenal global icon, Desmond Tutu. I propose to do two things today. So first, to surface two limitations of the book, because I suppose it's important, even when you go to the doctor, to get the bad news first. And then I would like to propose three characteristics about the Archer's life that I think the book is most successful at amplifying. And of course, this list is not exhaustive, and you know, we might find many other things that the book was successful at amplifying, other characteristics. So the first limitation, we intentionally conceptualize the construct of ecumenism in the book beyond the unity of churches to also broadly include a unity of multiple faith traditions towards the shared goals of peace and justice. Desmond Tutu's life and work has shaped not just the contours of ecumenical encounters between churches, but also created an ethical landscape of multiple faith traditions. His book, God is Not a Christian and Other Provocations, bears testament to his commitment to collegial collaboration and deeply engaged and robust encounter with various faith traditions. He has influenced generations of theologians, scholars, people of all faiths, and people with no faith. So our best efforts notwithstanding, we did not succeed in compiling and showcasing a comprehensive repertoire of the Archer's encounters with multiple faith traditions in the limited time frame that was available to us. This certainly constitutes a limitation in this book, but I think more importantly, a reminder that this work remains to be done. Beyond constituting a limitation, therefore, it is also an important reminder for those of us who work within ecumenical paradigms to be aware of the ways in which the goal of the unity of the churches might actually unintentionally reinscribe Christian normative ways of being that can sometimes lead to, at best, a lack of respect for religious diversity, and at worst, outright violence. So, for example, Lee Sharnick-Uderman's essay in the book explores such religious privilege and calls our attention to the ways in which Christianity is rendered normative through seemingly innocuous concepts like the rainbow. Her comparison between white privilege and religious privilege and the case studies of prejudices in France and South Africa regarding the choice of women to wear headscarves, for example, is an important prompt to check our religious privilege, especially the ways in which our engagements might reinscribe normativities. So that's sort of the first limitation of the book. Another limitation of this book, perhaps, is that we did not manage to depict her story as well as we could have. So in poor Tutu van Furth's short but hauntingly beautiful photo essay in the book, draws our attention to the deeply fundamental and central role that her mother played in the Tutu story. In this unusual photo taken at Mpo's marriage ceremony, it is Marleya who's foregrounded. Both Nyambura and Njoroge, another contributor in the book, and Mpo Tutu van Furth remind us about the neglect of her story when we tell the story of Desmond Tutu. Njoroge notes that Tutu, and I quote from her essay, made 48 visits to 25 countries within 3 years. And she says, I could not help but wonder what his beloved Leah and children felt, and said to him when he showed up at the door, I would love to hear the her story of Leah Tutu, she concludes. Indeed, this her story bears telling and is important legacy work that remains to be done. So despite the aforementioned limitations, we were still able to gather in this book the perspectives and stories of those whose personal and academic encounters with the Arch has shaped their ongoing faith-based activist and academic pursuits for justice and peace. What emerges from almost every single one of the 71 contributions, apart from the introduction, is the following three, and as I said at the beginning, there might be several more, of course, key characteristics of the Archer's life. And these are the three that I'd like to just briefly touch on this afternoon. The first is his spirituality. The second is his prophetic vision for justice. And the third is his wicked sense of humor. So, spirituality. His visions for justice, dignity, and peace are present, not in spite of his deep spirituality and sense of prayer, but because of it. This element of spirituality is a sacred thread that weaves each of the pieces of this tapestry of the Archer's life that we have brought together in this book. A great deal of the contributions in this book suggest that the path to peace and the strength needed for that journey was derived from a deep sense of spirituality and prayer. In fact, several contributions from Scandinavia and Europe, for example, talk about how before starting any meeting, even in predominantly secular settings, the Archbishop's invitation to prayer both surprises those present, but also sets the tone for the terms of engagement. Many contributors, such as Christian Balsov Olesen and Gerard Rein, for example, illustrate such encounters in their reflections, where they recall this invitation to prayer in both government settings and media settings and other such briefings. Paul Ustriker asks in his contribution to the book, from what does Desmond Tutu draw his strength? And I'm quoting him here. He says, I have no doubt from a disciplined life of prayer. He often surprises others by spontaneously turning to prayer with and for them, sometimes joyfully and at other times tearfully, end of quote. What is crucial for us to note is that this disciplined life of prayer and spirituality did not inspire a passive, contemplative life that was free of the moral imperative to fight injustices. On the contrary, as noted by Archbishop Thabo Makgoba in his essay, and I quote him, Archbishop Desmond Tutu used to say that an effective prayer life would never allow you to remain on your knees. No, it would compel you to get up and go out into the world to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, release to the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, unquote. And so that brings us then to the second important contribution that this book amplifies about the Archer's life, and that is his prophetic action for justice. He was truly a prophet. This vision for justice that derives from a strong theological and faith perspective is best described by Wilma Jacobson in the conclusion to her essay in this book. And she states, I quote, Desmond Tutu has always and is still always unequivocally clear about faith and justice and equality and inclusion, that God is not man, God is not homophobic, God is not a Christian, and all human beings, all people, all are made in the image of God. Close quote. Her salient assessment of Tutu's vision for justice is at once startling as it is simple. Indeed, God is not a man, not homophobic, and not Christian. The various narratives, however, presented in this book about the struggle for racial justice during apartheid invite a small addition to these observations. And that addition is God is not a white man. This particular appendage is significant, not least of all, because the struggle to overcome racism and white supremacy is at the heart of many of the recollections and ideas in this book. While it might be tempting to think that the struggle is over, at the time when I was writing this introduction, the South African Human Rights Commission reported that up to 90% of the complaints it received annually are about racism. Michael Battle reflects in his essay, and I quote him, "There's a subtle force to racism that often renders the church inept and on the wrong side of history," unquote. This is a strong reminder that the struggle is far from over, even as we recall the important solidarities that developed during the struggle. So many contributions in the book note that public displays of transnational solidarity against racism did not happen in a vacuum. It happened as a result of deep and considered attention to the ways in which the theological frameworks that uphold injustices needed to change. Theo Sundermeyer astutely observes in his essay that the value of developing contextuality as a focus in theological education was that it prevented the proliferation of abstract ideas in situations that called for concrete action. He notes, and I quote him from his essay, "In this tense situation, Tutu was the one who emphatically warned against following an abstract concept of freedom. This would lead to a functional narrowing of the concept," he says. He preferred to speak of liberation in Old Testament terms. Freedom is a communal concept because freedom is indivisible. Black theology not only serves the liberation of Black people, but also reveals the lack of freedom of the white oppressors and serves their liberation as well.
I think I can talk, can't I, because we're muted.
Sorry. David Haslam reminds us in his essay that this justice-seeking, change-making, and communal right relation needs to be consistently nurtured as he reflects on the crucial role of economic justice in the kingdom of God, drawing important parallels between the economic sanctions against the South African apartheid state and economic sanctions needed today against the state of Israel occupying the Palestinian territories. Ulrich Duchrell also draws lessons from this case study of resistance in South Africa for the current settler colonialist occupation and land justice question in Palestine. Brian Brown reminds us in his essay that, and I quote from his essay, "Few church leaders outside of Palestine have made themselves as conversant with these developments as the Arch. Few have told the dual narratives of Palestinian dispossession and Israeli domination so compellingly and so authentically. Few have suffered, as he has, the charges of anti-Semitism that invariably follow, and few have dared to share his pain shout on observing a people under ethnic-inspired occupation and dispossession for more than 50 years. This is apartheid," unquote. So while Tutu's call for sanctions as a non-violent means of political action was praised when it related to the matter of apartheid in South Africa, it often attracts charges of anti-Semitism when it relates to the issues of justice regarding Palestine. As with Michael Battle's observation about the church being on the wrong side of history when it comes to racism, this may unfortunately also very well be the case for the matter of injustice in the Holy Land. And so Basentia Kabe also notes regarding gender justice, and I'm moving to another area of justice, discerning a vocation as a woman, she says, when there are no other women priests, to reference within one's immediate context can be daunting, to say the least. Yet we drew our hope from ecclesiastical leaders in the caliber of the Arch and others who were standing on the truth that all who are called to serve, regardless of race, class, gender, and ethnicity, should be discerned and given a chance to live out their vocation. This stand was not only heartwarming, but also inviting, inclusive, and affirming, she says. So finally, I get to the last point. This book too asks the same central question posed in the Book of Joy, containing deep reflections by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu about joy in the midst of struggle and injustice. Is it really possible to be joyful even in the face of our daily troubles? Also contemplating on the utility of hope and joy, Roger Williamson, in his letter to the Archbishop, recalls, and I quote again from his essay, "I remember watching you," this is in a letter to the Arch, by the way, "I remember watching you as you danced down the aisle in the not so formal clerical lineup, which led me to coin the technical ecclesiastical term episco disco to commemorate your processing style. Where does this irrepressible hope and exuberant joy come from? Not because your life was easy. I think those of us not living under a repressive regime can hardly begin to imagine what it is like to live with such constant tension and danger." Close quote. The conundrum that Williamson raises regarding humor in the face of suffering and pain is a question raised by many of the contributors to this volume too. Taniko Maluleke asks the question most candidly in his essay, "How can the oppressed laugh?" In questions that almost leap up off the page and tug at one's heartstrings, Maluleke stirringly asks, "Surely," and I'm quoting him, "surely in such dry places, there are no wells of laughter from which the non-persons can draw. Ordinarily, one would not think that the poor and the marginalized have a need to cultivate and treasure a sense of humor. Of what use is a sense of humor for a people who walk daily in the shadow of death? Surely humor and laughter is wasted on the wretched of the earth. Surely those who travel up and down life's Jericho road in places where things constantly fall apart have no time for humor. Surely laughter should not be found in destitute villages and impoverished Black townships. To put it differently, for a people under siege and a people under the yoke of oppression, humor and laughter seem such a wasteful luxury to cultivate and nurture," unquote. Yet without exaggeration, the most commonly described and praised attribute of the Arch, appearing in almost every single essay, and I'm sure my co-editors here will agree, is his sense of inexplicable humor. Some ascribe his humor to a means of diffusing tension, while others see it as a more deliberate strategy to deal with social injustices, and at the same time provide a means to humanize relationships. What is most fascinating and noteworthy about all the observations offered by authors in this book regarding Tutu's humor is that the purpose of the humor was never to humiliate, only to humanize. And so his deep spirituality, his wicked sense of humor, and his commitment to Ubuntu and justice can be said to be the building blocks of Archbishop Tutu's staunch devotion to the process of peace. We risk a fundamental misunderstanding of the Arch's conceptions of peace, however, if we only frame it with the narrow ideas of non-violent passive resistance as opposed to active agitation and advocacy for justice that promotes social and systemic change. And so I end with the words of Tracy West, one of the contributors in her chapter in this book. And she tells us, she offers a sobering caution to us as we reflect with gratitude today and in the coming months, the role that the Arch played in developing and nurturing conscientization against injustice. She says, and I quote, "Such expressions of gratitude can be too easily reduced to something perfunctory and narrowly dutiful. They can seem like the delivery of a public thank you note that satisfyingly provides an obligatory acknowledgement of a past gift. The ongoing, renewing, dynamic impact of the Archbishop's leadership is lost in this kind of gratitude. It is as if the accomplishments are commodities being recreationally served up to social justice tourists. This type of gratitude fails to nurture the kind of thoughtful birthing of communal right relation that most authentically reflects the Archbishop's change-making leadership, unquote. And so my hope for us as we continue to reflect on the life and legacy of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu is that we might not also, like Tracy West warns us, become social justice tourists. I thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah Jean, for a brilliant sweep across the wide-ranging contributions in that book, and a really stimulating start for us. Thank you very much indeed. Let's hear now from, well, we've got two partner editors in Ecumenical Encounters in Germany, Rudolf Hinz and Professor Dietrich Verner. They're the next contributors. We've suggested Rudolf might speak to us about the importance of the Arch in the wider context, particularly the European context, although of course I now see we've got people visiting us from other parts of the world as well. But Rudolf was the former Africa Secretary of the EKD in Germany and the Director of World Service for Lutheran World Federation, also in Geneva, and now a lecturer in theology at Kiel University. So a lot of experience. And Rudolf, please share with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Immediately after Christmas, nearly all German newspapers, local and national, had an article on the death of Desmond Tutu. Not just a short news, but long articles describing Tutu's life and work. He was mainly described as an anti-apartheid activist. The Nobel Peace Prize laureate, of course, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and of course, General Secretary of the SACC and Archbishop in Cape Town. But we knew him in the first place as a priest, a deeply rooted Christian following the Sermon of the Mount, and a spiritual leader with a warm heart. Paul Österreicher, well known in Britain and Germany, wrote in his contribution for our book about a visit to the Tutu family in Orlando. Mpilu was up at 5, pounding the neighborhood roads to keep fit. There followed the essential priest, breaking bread on that day as every day, celebrating the Eucharist, but without the ecclesiastical trappings. The liturgy had long been internalized, moving swiftly, almost silently, until the form gave way to spontaneity, to intercession, to prayer for a suffering world to be loved. That took a lot of time, moving from the local and personal to the global and universal, taking to God everything that mattered on that day. I was sharing an intimate conversation around the world that Desmond was serving. Again, I quote what Sargini quoted. Paul raised the question, from what did Desmond draw his strength? I have no doubt, from a disciplined life of prayer. Those of us who visited Kotzer House, the headquarters of the SACC, will certainly remember the wonderful daily morning prayers at 8:30 in a packed hall. Hildegard Teves, one of our authors, she wrote, "The spirit of the house was set by Desmond Tutu and served by Bernard Spong as a house chaplain. Tutu's inspiration, his spirituality, his orientation towards the Bible, his attitude to prayer and the Eucharist shaped the community as a faithful Christian in the face of the fundamental evil of apartheid. Where do we have such spiritual depth in our church offices? Gottfried Kratz, a German pastor serving Christians in the townships around Cape Town, described Tutu's role in the struggle against apartheid. He remembered the dynamic came from the Black Base, where courage, imagination, and ultimately political strategic thinking had grown, which gave cohesion and direction to the resistance of the people. It just came from below and was picked up above by people like Desmond Tutu. We were grateful for these people in top positions, especially within the churches, whereas with us at the base, a greater sense of independence from the state could develop. Tutu was not only respected, he was popular. He was a black among the blacks in South Africa. And again, Ulrich Duchlo, professor in Heidelberg, he quoted a short discussion between Tutu and a young girl whose family was forcibly removed from a so-called black spot and dumped in one of the so-called homelands in 1979. Tutu asked her, "Does your mother receive a pension, a grant or something?" "No," she replied. "Then what do you do for food?" "We borrow food," she answered. "Have you ever returned any of the food you borrowed?" "No." "What do you do when you can't borrow food?" "We drink water to fill our stomachs." Tutu, with his warm heart, never forgot the short encounter with the victims of removals and shared the story on many occasions. He also told it Prime Minister Botha at that time when he met him with others. Whether this story reached his heart, the Prime Minister's heart, remains unknown. In my own contribution to the book, I wrote that I discovered in Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness. He wrote his first chapter, what he felt and thought after Election Day 1994. We South Africans will survive and prevail only together, black and white, bound together by circumstance and history, as we strive to claw our way out of the abyss of apartheid. Racism, up and out, black and white together. Neither group on its own can make it. God had bound us together. In a way, we are living out what Martin Luther King Jr. said, unless we learn to live together as brothers, hopefully also the sisters included, we will die together as fools. With this deep conviction, he took over the work as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He knew that another great task was to be taken over. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudolph, for those memories and perceptions, and and that helping increase our awareness of this very remarkable man. Professor Dietrich Verner is a senior theological advisor to Brood for Die Welt, who we understand were helpful in the production of this great book. And he's a professor in intercultural theology in Hermannsburg, a former director of the theological education program of the World Council of Churches, and therefore I think a successor of the Arch. And he's got particular knowledge of the Arch's role in developing theological education in Africa. So Dietrich, welcome, and please, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Just for a complimentary view, actually, on the topic of theological education, you will realize, might be, and hopefully with excitement, that already the second subsection in the book, which you have in front of you, is about liberation theology and theological education. The issue of theological education might be less in the newspapers today. Also, it was not mentioned at all, as far as I see, in the news coming after the death of Desmond Tutu recently. But still, I believe that theological education is a very formative factor for the role the Archbishop has played in overcoming apartheid and for his strong leadership role in African ecumenism as well as in global ecumenism. There are 2 articles or even more in the book which directly refer to the history of theological education in mentioning TEF. TEF stands for Theological Education Fund, London, Bromley, which was founded as a key instrument of the IMC, the International Missionary Council, the key instrument to build, to reconstruct, and to contextualize theological education in the Southern Hemisphere. And it was very formative and striking in the biography of the Arch. He had studied in London King's College already between 1962 and 1966, where very important first friendships formed for him. But then between 1972 and 1976, he was the first African director of the TEF program in London Bromley, which only later was integrated in the WCC, becoming the Program on Theological Education, and later ETE in Geneva, where I served as a director for 7 years. Therefore, my particular passion and interest for theological education, and just a special invitation to all of you, once you come to Geneva, or once you have younger scholars who would still be interested to do a theological dissertation, please advise them to look for the archives of TEF, because I was really impressed. If you go down the stairs in WCC Ecumenical Center and look at the archives, all the key archives of TEF files are still there. A lot of personal reports and writings also of Desmond Tutu, because he was key for bringing up and for contextualizing theological education in many of the major sites in African countries. And what I really realized, only because I have special knowledge and was also of good friendship with the archivist who helped me, that there was one surprising document which I never saw before, because in 75, after his last trip for TEF, Desmond Tutu wrote a kind of final report to his fellow staff, Aaron Sapsitian, other Shoki Ko, so big names in the history of theological education. These were his companion at that stage. And I would like to leave with you 3 major short quotes, which are very impressive for me to mark the special taste, the visionary approach of Desmond Tutu in the area of theological education. First, his plea for a genuine African contextualization. He criticized very boldly, it's also a bit of his wicked sense of humor, as Sarojini has mentioned. He criticized his colleagues openly in his last report to the TEF team in mentioning, we often give the impression that we are a sort of imperialists by appearing to boss people around once they apply for grants. We ask far too many questions in their view, or force people to out their requests in a particular way to suit our ideological stance. We do not seem to respect their integrity. And however much we speak of contextuality, it often appears to be our understanding of what their contextuality ought to be. End of quote. So this is a first taste of his critical and very sharp appreciation of funding and scholarships. And that key lesson needs to be still learned by many organizations working in this area. But a second major quote from the same report also has a key message on his understanding, his critical understanding of the relevance of the missionary legacy for post-colonial Africa. And I quote again, Tutu saying, as for myself looking at Africa, I think that in many ways the quite vilified expatriate missionary has really done a splendid job of work. Hospitals, schools, theological colleges, agricultural education, technical education, many of these in most countries owe much to their efforts. And it would be churlish and indeed unchristian not to acknowledge this indeed and fervent gratitude to God and to them. Many of us are converts today due to their efforts, and we should not allow the many faults in a great deal of what they did to blind us to the extraordinary results of their work. Most of the political leaders in Africa are Christians or obtaining most of their training in Christian schools, and interestingly, many leaders of the liberation movement are indeed ordained men. They must have caught the vision of something most worthwhile from somewhere. Of course, now in Africa, we are calling for a Christianity which is authentically African, in contradistinction to one which remained basically alien and imported. There is also the continued struggle for liberation. These are almost all-consuming interests and concerns in Africa today. Now, this certainly is not the only statement Desmond Tutu has done on the colonial missionary heritage, but it is an important statement also to listen to his positive and appreciating role of Western mission, despite all the wrongdoings that is also in his mind. So the last quote I would like to use has to do with a plea of Desmond Tutu for a comprehensive overhaul of the system of theological education in Africa. I think that is still relevant for today, and therefore I have noted this in this article. Our seminary graduates tend far too often, Tutu writes, for comfort to be elitist, uncritical, conforming, and authoritarian. I fear that it seems to me our theological education system needs a major overhaul if its products seem to be so unsatisfactory. And this in particular in two areas as I see it. And then the first area he's highlighting is about spirituality. As Sarojini has talked a lot about his commitment to spirituality, and Rudolf as well, I will skip this, but take only the second one to abbreviate, which is on critical awareness, his insistence that theological education can be done properly only by a critical contextual awareness. And I quote, "Our theological education must set out before it is too late to develop the whole personality of the theological student, and especially his critical awareness, which has a passion and a reverence for truth, and will not be cajoled or threatened to believe something to be true unless it recommends itself as a reasonable thing to conclude on the basis of the available evidence. It will make them ask awkward questions and not to be merely conforming, and only thus can they ever hope to be creative. Only those ready to challenge the existing orthodoxies have ever advanced men's knowledge. Only those who have developed a passion for truth can ultimately be expected to become prophetic leaders, to speak out against unrighteousness and injustice and oppression with fear and favor." End of quote. I think both this passion for truth and the insistence to be open, to be inspired as prophetic leaders, to serve the gospel in today's world, that has marked the ministry of the Arch for many generations. And I think putting an insistence on the relevance of theological education is still very important for us. The majority of those sitting around the screen are probably beyond 60, as I am myself, very much so already. And I think the generation to come after us, and many of us have served in theological education, how to inspire the younger generation of Christian leaders to follow the footsteps of public theology, to follow the footsteps of doing theology in a contextual and prophetic manner, like Desmond Tutu has done. That is a key responsibility we have to transmit, and we have to share with future generations and encourage them still to study theology. That is not an easy situation now in Germany, and might also not be in Britain. Thanks a lot for your short attention.
Thank you, Dietrich, and a really good, strong challenge to us there at the end to keep liberation theology alive and alive for this next generation. And we I'm sure here are all committed to that and need to practice it. And thanks to both of you for being able to speak English so well. Congratulations to the Germans. We're not very good, as you know, in Britain on that. So thank you both. Linda Woodhead is the FD Morris Professor and Head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College in London. King's is where the Arch studied, as we've heard, for his master's degree, and perhaps the institution in the UK which can claim the greatest role in celebrating and maintaining the Arch's legacy. And Linda may hopefully be able to tell us a bit more about that, but welcome, Linda, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, colleagues and friends, old and new, for this lovely invitation. Well, for nearly 2 centuries now, King's College London has dedicated itself to the service of society. Its graduates, academics, Nobel laureates have made vital contributions in the arts, healthcare, science, education, politics, religion, law, and justice. Of these, none is more esteemed than Archbishop Desmond Tutu, whose larger-than-life picture greets you outside the main building and who holds a special place in the heart of King's. I've got the honour to be the new head of the department in which he studied. It's now called the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Desmond Tutu took his bachelor's and master's degrees at King's in the 1960s. And then later he was made a fellow of King's College in 1978. In 2004, he was visiting professor in post-conflict societies. I should tell you a story against ourselves as well. It's a story that Professor Hans Engdahl told me. After he'd done his MA, Desmond Tutu explored doing a PhD on the Old Testament and bringing in the African context. But the professor of the time concluded there wasn't enough material to warrant a study, and Tutu was denied. That tells us something. But let's go back to 1962 when Desmond Tutu arrived as a student, aged, I think, 31. Last week, I spoke to a gentleman in his late 90s, Martin Kenyon, who says he picked up the newly arrived family from the station and took them to their new digs in London. And a friendship was forged that remains to this day. And here's another recollection. It was sent to me on Facebook by Rosina Elston after the Archbishop's recent death. And I see her daughter is with us today. Rosina was the theology faculty secretary when Desmond Tutu came to study. And she remembers, as secretary, I wrote invitations to freshers' teas at Vincent Square. Finally, he, Desmond, arrived, and I wondered in awe at a man who came from that terrible regime in South Africa where the Sharpeville massacre had happened. I remember giggling in the Theological library. When he looked at us over the top of his specs, we knew it was time to go for that long coffee in the next door coffee shop. I remember when Mpo fell out of a window of their house. Luckily, she was unscathed. It was the beginning of a long friendship for me. I watched the morning service from St. George's Cathedral, Cape Town this morning and felt close. His home cathedral. It's strange when a friend becomes a famous personage, but he never ever changed in his love and passion for life. I often dreamed of him in the dark days of South Africa and was able to speak up for him on the BBC. There is a bond which goes deeper than we know in this physical world. When Desmond Tutu came to King's in 1962, ours was a department of theology. Today is a Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and that means we have specialists in many religions besides Christianity. Desmond Tutu approved because his vision of ecumenism, as Saragini said, went way beyond Christianity alone. As the title of his book says, God is not a Christian. But adding religious studies to theology is a mistake if theology just goes on as if nothing has changed. then you get a two-tier system in which Christians are allowed to work out the implications of their faith from the inside, but all other religions are studied from the outside. As Desmond Tutu also recognised, that's a form of Christian exclusivism, and it is bound up with colonialism. To truly bring together T and RS, theology and religious studies, means putting all kinds of religion and spirituality into what you are engaged with. And it means breaking down three divisions. First, the division between just an insider and just an outsider approach. Second, the division between the normative and the descriptive. And thirdly, the division between so-called world religions and other everyday and indigenous and so-called folk religions. Or to use much worse language, between the real religions that are worthy of respect and study and so-called superstition, paganism, idolatry, and magic, things that colonialism despised. Theology in the broadest, most open sense, where those divisions get broken down, made the Archbishop, and he made it. And as we've heard in the second section of the book, Ecumenical Encounters, there's a wonderful overview of his rich and radical contribution to theological education, including that early work in London with the WCC. Desmond Tutu's approach still inspires and challenges us at King's. It's why we do theology with religious studies and religious studies with theology.
Mamle.
It's why there have been and continue to be many initiatives at King's on the part of colleagues past and present, honouring the legacy of the Archbishop. It's why we're delighted to be starting to work with Professor Sarojini Neda to memorialise the Archbishop in various ways. And as Dietrich said, we're wanting very much to bring our students together and to learn about and from Desmond Tutu. As Dietrich said, bringing the next generation is very, very important. Some of my students said to me, we want to do more with you on this because a lot of our peers don't know who Desmond Tutu was. So much to be grateful for, much to celebrate, and much still to do. Archbishop Tutu, your spirit is alive here in the heart of London.
Thank you, Linda, and let's hope not just in the heart of London, but the heart of Britain and indeed the world. But that was a challenging and encouraging contribution. So thank you very much for that. And we look forward to hearing what King's will be doing for Tutu's legacy in the future also. And now, apologies to Paul, we're running a bit late, but I'm glad he's back with us. Lord Paul Boateng, who first met the Arch back in 1988 when as vice moderator of the World Council of Churches programme to combat racism. He went to support the Arch in Soweto at Regina Mundi during the state of emergency. And then he also worked with him as a government minister from the UK and in South Africa as the High Commissioner there. And he told me he hosted the Arch's 75th birthday party at the Commissioner's residence there in South Africa to raise funds for the Tutu Foundation and the Tutu Archive, I think, at King's. And Paul was involved in setting up the UK Tutu Foundation. If we don't know about it, there's to their website, and Paul's now a vice patron of that foundation. Paul, the screen is yours.
Thank you, David. So good to be with so many friends and comrades. What's to be said about the Arch? What's to be said about Desmond Tutu that hasn't already been said? I think all of us bring memories. All of us bring to the table what it was about this man that didn't just change events, but changed us. Because that's what he did. You couldn't encounter the Arch without being deeply affected. And you knew that this was a man who would make a difference. This was a man who had made a difference. This was a man who, wherever he was and at any time, made a difference. So my first recollection of meeting him was indeed at Regina Mundi in Soweto, where I had been sent by the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches to represent the WCC as vice moderator of its program to combat racism. And it was at the height of the state of emergency. The church was rung around with barbed wire, roadblocks, Caspias, these armored cars. And you got a sense of just how profoundly threatening the power of the spirit that this man and the people of South Africa and those who were gathered there today on that day, how profoundly threatening it was to the established order as it was then of hatred, and what had only recently been declared at the Lusaka Declaration in the presence of Oliver Tambo and Bears Naude and many others, Charles of Vicentia, what had been declared by the WCC a sin. And you got this sense when you met the Arch, when you participated in the service, yes, of the spiritual power of the man, of his convening capacity. It was a truly ecumenical event. Every strand of faith and belief was there. And there, yes, absolutely committed to the struggle against racism, but infused with a joy that the Archbishop was capable, in the most dire and desperate of circumstances, as was the case in the state of emergency, the joy he was able to evoke. And we danced, we toy-toyed, the whole congregation, dancing with the power of the Spirit. And you knew then that power would ultimately triumph. But you knew also that you were up against an implacable enemy, because I recalled going with Bishop Hurley. How blessed we were in the world to have such men and women at the head of the struggle in South Africa and inspiring us as they did. But I remember going with Bishop Hurley to the police station in Soweto. This pushy young, newly elected Black MP and this venerable Catholic dignitary, both demanding on the instructions of the Arch that this young man be released, but it was to no avail. And he disappeared into the prison system, only to emerge many months later. And then moving on just a year, and this gives you a sense of what it was, the power that the Arch was able to evoke globally, the way he was able to inspire us all, ordinary people, to do extraordinary things. I was a guest at the Kirchentag. It must have been 1989 because it was in Berlin. But before going there, I went on a Thursday morning to a picket in Frankfurt. And this group of women every Thursday met outside the consulate general in Frankfurt, and they prayed. That's all they did. They prayed for peace, for reconciliation, for the end of apartheid. I remember those remarkable women, and the first question those women asked me when I arrived on the picket line was, we hear you were in Soweto. You met the Archbishop. What was he like? That was their concern, because he had inspired them in rain and the cold, come rain or shine. He had inspired them to go out on a Thursday morning and to pray and to make their stand. I never forget them. And I won't forget that Kirk and Tag either. It's perfectly true, David. Unfortunately, we don't speak very well other people's languages in our country. But they gave me something, and I was able to understand that, even though I don't speak German. And I've got it now. I've still got the Bible that they gave me in I was given in 1989, and they gave me these stickers on it. I've still got it to this day. And the messages are true to this day. Gib Nazis keine Chance. Alle Menschen sind Ausländer fast überall. Don't give Nazis, don't give the racists a chance. And all of us somewhere are foreigners. Powerful messages evoked by the life of the Arch and his struggle against racism, his struggle to build a common humanity so that we are all part of one family. No one is a stranger anywhere because we are part of one race, the human race. That was his message. The dance of joy. And then, you mentioned it, the party that Janet and I had for him with King's and King's College. A number of folk from King's were there because we were trying to raise money for the archive. And the Arch and Leah were there. FW, the clerk, was there. We had 2 Nobel laureates in the garden, in the house in Cape Town. And we danced again. Hundreds of us at that birthday party. We danced around the garden. The British residence has never seen dancing like it. We toy-toyed. And we toy-toyed in that same spirit of joy, that same spirit of determination to come together against injustice. He led us in a dance. And it's that dance of joyfulness and of inspiration. That's the dance we must go on dancing. That's what he expects us to do. That's the challenge, to continue the dance. Hambakale, Desmond. Hambakale. Go well.
Thank you very much, Paul. Some great memories there and some good ranging sharing of your experience of the Arch. We did say we were going to, we hope you've been monitoring the chat, and we've asked Roger Williamson, one of our group, he was going to be keeping an eye on the chat. So I'm going to just see, before we call on Edwin as our last speaker, to see if there's any highlights from the chat we ought to pay attention to. Roger, have you got anything for us?
Plenty, in fact, far too much. So I think we should press on. People have underlined his spirituality, been reinforcing the points that the speakers have made. But I think in view of the time, we should press on.
Okay, and thanks to all who have contributed, and do run back through it if you like, because I've had a few glances and there are some good thoughts there and some good cross references, as it were, and for us to follow up. But so last but certainly not least comes Reverend Edwin Harrison from South Africa. He first met the Archbishop, it says in the book, in 1988 when, 1985, he was encouraged by him to study theology and ordained by him then in 1992. And Edwin often worked with the Archbishop as his assistant chaplain. And now he's the General Secretary of Kairos, South Africa, and works as the development officer of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation there in South Africa. So Edwin, thanks for patience and welcome. The screen is yours. Edwin, we can't hear you. Are you talking to us?
Thank you so much, David. Can you hear me now?
Yes, got you.
Yes, and thank you for wonderfully convening all of us. I'm able to see people I have not seen for a while now. I mean, it's Hans Engdahl is here, Rodney Dre is here, Crystal Lombard, and many other friends are here. So it's really good, and thank you for doing this. And last night we had a celebration with Sabeel, and tomorrow with people in Indianapolis and so on. And so these celebrations are continuing all the time. So thank you for doing this. It helps us in our mourning and also in thinking through the way forward for the legacy work. I have many, many memories of the Arch over a period of about 37 years, and having had the privilege to serve him and with him. But I will confine what I say to the first few years of working with him, since this is what led me to the priesthood, and also deep reflection on the Eucharist, and ultimately to my article in the book entitled An Ubuntu Eucharistic Prayer. The actual writing of this Eucharistic prayer did not take me more than an hour, I think, but it was really a culmination of many, many thoughts over many years, including thoughts from Richard Rohr, whom I took to the Arch's office a few years ago. Let me start in 1986. I was already an ordinand for the priesthood when Archbishop Tutu arrived in Cape Town, but I did not attend his consecration on 7 September 1986 because some of us were in prison at the time. In fact, before he arrived, we were arrested several times in Cape Town in the mid-80s. And during one of our weekend stays at Paulsmoor Prison in Cape Town, we were about 30 men in a cell. And on the Sunday morning, we celebrated the Eucharist with some bread and some juice that we had there. And what was wonderful about that was that we asked one of the Muslim inmates who were with us, Sheikh Habir, to read to us from the Quran. And if I remember correctly, the Muslims who were with us also shared in the Eucharist service and in the celebration of the service with us. So my understanding of how all people can be included into the Eucharistic celebration actually started fermenting before the Arch's official arrival in Cape Town. The regime, of course, the apartheid regime knew that some of us wanted to be at the consecration service on 7 September, but they unfortunately only released me on 9 September, 2 days after the consecration. But even though we could not be there, we all knew that his accession to the position of Archbishop, the first Black Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, meant that freedom was not too far away. And so it was in early 1987 when a few months into his archbishopric, the Arch called us, several of us together on a retreat, and it was there that I was selected to start my theological studies. It was my first really close encounter with him. He did individual interviews, and when I entered his room, he was sitting cross-legged like a Buddha on the bed. He had a big pack of chips with him, and he offered me some. I was very nervous, but I need not have been. He knew that I was a church-based anti-apartheid activist, but most of the interview actually was about my prayer life and what I'm doing to sustain that. And by the end of that weekend, I was one of those selected for the priesthood, and I had to be in Grahamstown to start my studies in early 1988. And so my ordination to the diaconate in April 1992, after 4 years of study, 3 in Grahamstown, 1 at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, was supposed to be done by the Suffragan bishop, but he could not be there. That was in April 1992. And so we asked the Arch to do the ordination service at Khayelitsha, at St. Peter's Khayelitsha in Cape Town. And what a joyful service that was. 8 months later, he ordained us as priests in the cathedral, in the same cathedral where his funeral service happened. Before he ordained us, however, there was an ordination service in September of 2 women priests, Wilma Jacobson and Margaret Virtue. He felt very strongly that their ordination should happen before ours, since they had been waiting for so long. He was a strong supporter of the ordination of women. We were more than happy to wait and celebrate the special service with the first women priests in the Diocese of Cape Town. The women, therefore, celebrate their 30th anniversary of the ordination in September this year. And of course, we will celebrate our 30th anniversary to the ordination of the priesthood in December of this year. I remember before our ordination actually happened in the cathedral, the Arch took us down to the crypt, and in a very soft voice, he said to us, he said, once you are ordained today, you will say the words of Jesus over ordinary wine and bread, and it will become the body and the blood of Christ. It was only then that the gravity of that moment really struck me. These words have stayed with me for a long time, so that whenever I preside at the Eucharist, I do so with a certain amount of fear and trepidation. And so writing the Ubuntu Eucharistic prayer was therefore a rare privilege in which I tried to capture all that I'd learned from him. And of course, I celebrated the Eucharist with him many times, even at his house here in Hermanus, which is about 10 minutes drive from where I live. In it, I say, in the Eucharistic prayer, I say that Jesus knew the strengths and the weaknesses of his disciples. He knew their strengths and weaknesses, and yet he gave his body and blood even to Judas. Judas is therefore part of us, part of his body, and we have to take responsibility for Judas. In the Eucharistic prayer, I write, I will quote from it just very briefly. I say, Jesus, we are all made in your image. Christians, Jews and Muslims, Buddhists and Hindus, and even those who claim to have little faith or no faith. With you, superiority is a lie. Apartheid is a sin. Division is no more. Inequality is evil. And I want to underline that and say that I fully agree with what Sir Roger was saying. I'm not sure if the institutional church will ever practice the radical inclusiveness of Jesus, but certainly Archbishop Tutu did, and we also have to. We cannot wait. I'm, for example, now in touch with Reverend Mary Ryan in Cape Town, who is a Roman Catholic woman priest. I'm told that there are about 200 Roman Catholic women priests worldwide, and I've invited her to preside at the Eucharist at Volmut, which is close to where I live, here in September of this year. We cannot wait on the institutional church. We have to lead it where it will not go. And Archbishop Tutu showed us how to do that. May he continue to inspire us. Amen.
Thank you, Edwin. That's an interesting note to finish on. We can't wait for the institutional church. Yes, and, I'm sure all of us here have had some experiences of that one way or another. Well, we're coming towards the end of our program. I'm just going to ask Richard Burridge if he's got a word or two to add to us, if Richard's still with us, as he's here all the way from the States and former Dean of King's College and had a lot to do with the Arch in his earlier days. Richard, are you there? Do you want to
Yes, I am.
Do share a word or two with us. Yeah.
I know you're running late, so I'm conscious that you are giving me a huge honor. And it remains the case that I am in deep grief, the loss of my father in God, and the fact that I tried my very hardest to get to the funeral, but the Dean of the Cathedral and Barney Pitiana both said, well, I could have one of their seats or whatever, but I didn't want to take a seat away. There were only 25 for Malaya and the family. And so I took a vow of self-restraint, which those who know me well know that it's not very common in Burridge. And didn't go, but missed it terribly. I watched it on SABC and was glad to see that they were using the piece that I had pre-recorded from them in the King's Chapel about the Arch. I just want to reinforce all that is said. If I may, I will tell the story that many of you have heard me before. My first, having worked in the anti-apartheid movement throughout my student days, my first time I met him and Malaya and John Allen, was the same day, May the 1st, 1990, that Mandela was meeting with de Klerk formally for the ANC with the nationalist government. We've been trying to get the Arch to Exeter to give him an honorary degree and to give a very fascinating lecture on the moral arch of the universe, using Martin Luther King's phrase, relating the situation in South Africa to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we planned, first of all, South African government wouldn't give him a passport. And it just so happened that when they did give him the passport, it happened to be this day. And of course, that meant that he was absolutely top of special branches security concerns for the day, because anybody who threw something at him or took a pot shot at him while he was in the leafy groves of Exeter would have derailed these really important talks back in Cape Town. And so I was still a very young priest, nervously waiting in the Archbishop of Canterbury's special immigration lounge in the VIP suite at Heathrow. They kept the airplane engines running, told everybody else that they hadn't linked up properly yet and keep their seatbelts on, while armed police boarded the plane and brought Desmond and Leah and John and the Arch's chaplain off the plane. And of course, his first words entering the immigration area was, "Can we have the Eucharist?" Because he'd flown all night, and as we've heard, he would not eat or drink until he had had the Eucharist. And they said, no, there's no time. We've got to get you out of here before we let the rest of the plane dock. Straight into armored cars to Heathrow, to Reading, where we were going to get the train to Exeter, only to find that the train was delayed. And when we were standing on the platform, a great big burly West Indian porter came up and enveloped Desmond in a bear hug, much to the horror of all these armed police. So they hid him in the security place where they let him play with all the cameras zooming in on people, which is what he said they did to him back home. And it was about 10:30, 11 a.m. and he still hadn't had anything to eat or drink by the time we got on to the train and got into the first class car. And what he didn't know was that all the guys in business suits with these mobile phones the size of a brick were armed security. And the little guy from the British Rail was told he only had to speak to me. And he said, "I'm sure you're keen for breakfast." I said, yes, but first I need a small bottle of red wine and a piece of bread. And he looked at me and with a startled look and said, "A piece of bread for everybody, sir?" I said, no, just one piece of bread will be fine. And you could see that he'd been instructed to be as helpful as possible. So he said, "Would the Archbishop like me to cut it up for him, sir?" And I said, no, I think he'll break it. The guy had one more attempt to be helpful. "Would he like it buttered, sir?" And that was my introduction to the Arch. And for the next 25 years, every time he was in London, it didn't matter what time it was, and Poe or Twinsy or somebody would ring me up and say it was my job to make sure that there were people at the hotel or where we were keeping him when he was staying with us in Kings at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. or whatever time it was. There was somebody for him to be able to have the Eucharist with. And my last visit to him was I always went to have Eucharist with him on his birthdays, was on his 88th, because I couldn't get there for the 89th or the 90th because of COVID. And it is that memory that has come out to a way that everything flows from this. It was that chance encounter with a priest of the Community of the Resurrection. He wasn't Trevor Huddleston. I know that Desmond is insistent it was, but Trevor was not in South Africa when Desmond was 8. And I think that's actually quite nice that it was just an anonymous priest of the CR who walked through Sophiatown and doffed, he must have been mad, and he must have been baking hot in full robes in the heat of the Johannesburg day. And he took off his big priestly hat and doffed it to Desmond's mother and said, "Good morning, madam." And that 8-year-old boy's life was changed, because if a white man was going to pay respect and see the glory of God in his mum, whatever that man was on, he wanted. And of course, it was Trevor who visited the young Arch, when he got TB in 1011, taught him to assist at the Mass, gave his scruffy urchin best mate friend, Hugh Masekela, his first trumpet. And you just think, what an extraordinary thing that a young priest should care for two 11-year-old street urchins who turn out to be Desmond Tutu and Hugh Masekela. And so for me, that was the reason why, and we've said it time after time after time, he was convinced that everybody mattered. He loved all. It was his favorite thing to say, all, and fling his arms wide open. And he did that once when I was interviewing him with Rowan Williams and Jonathan Sachs on either side. And when he flung his arms wide, he thumped both of them in the solar plexus and knocked them off their seats. But he said it didn't matter, as we've heard, what your sexuality, what your color, what your race, and he would often say, what even the shape of your nose, because of course his nose was always a self-joke, but he did use it to great effect with the Tutsis and the Hutu in Rwanda, because they had different shaped noses. God loved everybody and cared everybody because of that lesson he learned at the age of 8. And that's huge.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Richard, for those last memories to be shared with us. Yeah. And we've had personal insights, theological insights, prophetic insights, pastoral insights, spiritual insights about this remarkable man. And we hope what's been shared this afternoon will really help to keep his legacy, his memories alive. The book, as we said at the beginning, Ecumenical Encounters with Desmond Tutu, is available from Regnum Books here in the UK. You just Google Regnum Books and you'll find your way to that book. £18, I think, plus the postage. We want to make it Regnum Books' best seller ever, so do go for it, because it's such a collection of inspiration and challenge and insight and uplift, and we all need that at this particular time. Very warm thanks to all our speakers and the contributors through the chat, others who've made their presence felt in that way. King's College, I know, is reflecting on how to best remember the Arch's legacy, and as I'm sure the Tutu Foundation, I think King's may have an event coming up in April, and I think the Tutu, the foundation is planning an evensong at Westminster Abbey. Provisional date is June the 9th at 5 o'clock, but that I'm sure will be on their website.
I think that's no longer provisional. It's on the Abbey website, and I was talking to the Dean about it recently.
Right.
Evensong 5 or 5:30, Sunday the 9th of June.
Right, but that's now fixed. Thank you, Richard. Well, again, many thanks to our speakers and contributors. And now I'm going to hand on, if the speakers and the planning group want to stay on for 5 minutes after we close, but now I'm grateful that Bishop Rose Hudson-Wilkin, who's of course the Bishop of Dover and the former chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons, she's agreed to offer a few final reflections and send us on our way in prayer. So Rose, over to you.
I think I would like to say that my reflections will be caught up in the prayers. We've heard lots this afternoon. And as we remember the Archbishop, we remember his hunger for justice. So we pray this evening for all those who are still hungry for justice, for all those who are willing to document inequalities, to demonstrate against tyranny, to distinguish between need and greed, and for those who are sometimes misrepresented or persecuted in the process. As we pray for all that has been witnessed in the Archbishop's life, all those whom he has inspired and touched, all that he has made possible through his ministry. We give thanks and pray that we will never be worn and tired from seeking justice and from giving and sharing God's love with one another. And as we look to you, O God, we remember because you made the world and intended it to be a good place and called its people your children, because when things seemed at their worst, you came in Christ to bring out the best in us. So gracious God, we gladly say, goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than hate. Light is stronger than darkness. Truth is stronger than lies. Because confusion can reign inside us despite our faith, because anger, tension, bitterness, and envy distort our vision, because our minds sometimes worry small things out of all proportion, because we do not always get it right, we want to believe goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than hate. Light is stronger than darkness. Truth is stronger than lies. Because you have promised to hear us and are able to change us and are willing to make our hearts your home, we ask you to confront, forgive, and encourage us as you know best. Let us cherish in our hearts our beloved Archbishop, his family, and let us proclaim with our lips that which we believe like him in our hearts, that goodness is stronger than evil, love is stronger than hate, light is stronger than darkness, and truth is stronger than lies. And so I end with the Franciscan blessing. May God bless us with this comfort, at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain to joy. And may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in the world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all God's children in God's world. My brothers and sisters, this is the day that the Lord has made. So let us rejoice and be glad in it as we remember our beloved brother and father in Christ. And as we remember, let us not offer offerings that cost nothing. Let us, in his footsteps, seek to continue to look and work for peace and to pursue it. Amen.
Amen.